Hi, I'm Dr. Walter Matwichuk, and the purpose of today's video is to talk to you a little bit about how to effectively use the ABC framework of rational emotive behavior therapy by learning to identify the inferences, attitudes, feelings, and behavior that make up the framework and are distinct components of it. Effective use of the framework requires that people see that although thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are interconnected, in order to effectively use the framework, one needs to learn to recognize and separate thoughts from feelings and feelings from behavior. We need to appreciate the difference between inferences, which are a particular type of cognitions, and attitudes, which are a wholly different sort of cognition. Generic CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, emphasizes inferences and targets them for change. Well, REBT is unique and distinct insofar as it targets attitudes and emphasizes the importance of identifying and then challenging and modifying these attitudes in order to produce a profound philosophical emotional change. Now, the ABC model starts by identifying what's called an adversity. An adversity is a negative state of affairs, and this negative state of affairs that's associated with emotional disturbance can be rooted in the past, the distant past, or even the recent past, the present, or the future. Memories of distant events that are associated with emotional disturbance might be an example of an adversity that's rooted in the distant past. On the other hand, something that happened yesterday is also a memory, and one could be disturbed today about more recent memory. Likewise, one could be disturbed about something that's happening in the present, or they can be disturbed about something they anticipate, some negative state of affairs that they anticipate in the future. Now, REBT's ABC framework aims to help people identify when they're in a state of disturbance, which we consider to be under the influence of unhealthy negative emotions. These emotions are listed here. There are 8 of them. And the goal of REBT is to help people learn how to first spot their self-defeating unhealthy negative emotions, and then to use the process known as disputing, the reflective process known as disputing, to transform their negative emotional experience into a healthy negative emotional experience. So we're looking to take self-defeating, unhealthy negative emotions and through the reflective process known as disputing, to then transform those feelings into healthy negative emotions, which will help us then change what we can change and to live well or reasonably happily when the adversity that we're facing cannot be changed or cannot be quickly changed. Unhealthy negative emotions are rooted in adversity. They're an acknowledgement of adversity, and they're rooted in rigid and extreme thinking. We in REBT theorize that unhealthy negative emotions lead to self-defeating behavior and often short-term oriented behavior, such as aggressive behavior, saying something that we may later regret, doing something that we may later regret. And in general, they are not conducive to constructive action. Alternatively, healthy negative emotions are also an acknowledgement of an adversity at A, but they're rooted in flexible and non-extreme thinking. This flexible and non-extreme thinking sets the stage for healthy negative emotions that then motivate us to address the adversity in a creative, persisting, and constructive way. Under the influence of healthy negative emotions, people tend to be assertive, not aggressive. They tend to have a certain poise that enables them to do what's best in the long run and to tolerate the uncomfortable feeling that they may have in the short run. REBT emphasizes what is known as the principle of emotional responsibility. This idea is rooted in Stoic philosophy and dates back well over 2,000 years and was stated in Stoic philosophy by the emancipated slave Epictetus, who said that people are not disturbed by things, but by their views of them. Rational emotive behavior therapy argues that we are largely responsible for our emotional upset. And we look to empower people by emphasizing how our basic attitudes play a more important role than the adversity plays in determining our emotional consequences. Many people will believe that circumstances cause their emotional upset. And the problem with that model is that we're then a prisoner of circumstances. REBT attempts to show that although adversity contributes to our emotional responding, our basic attitudes play a significant role, a more significant role in determining our emotional responses, thereby allowing us to change our basic attitude towards adversity and have leverage over our emotional and behavioral response. The ABC framework of REBT attempts to help people see that flexible and non-extreme attitudes lie at the core of emotional health, whereas rigid and extreme attitudes lie at the core of emotional disturbance. It's important that people make a distinction between what we call the situational adversity and the critical inference. Now, a situational adversity would be an objective description of a negative state of affairs. One might say that the situational adversity is the data that the sights and sounds a camera would pick up when recording a person in a particular circumstance. It is more or less factual data of the context that's occurring. However, the critical A is very important to ferret out, and it's buried within the situational A. The critical A is the inference that is associated with our emotional upset. Inferences are statements about matters that are not directly known to us. They're hunches. So if you're in a situation and you hear a fire alarm, you may have the hunch there's a fire, or you may have the hunch that it's a fire drill. Now, you may not know for sure which of these hunches is true. And so some inferences could be, in fact, true, while others can be inaccurate. REBT initially doesn't focus on the accuracy of inferences in the way other cognitive behavior therapists are inclined to do. Instead, REBT uses the inference as a stepping stone to help us identify a different thought known as an attitude, which is a deeper level cognition. And we believe in REBT lies at the core of the emotional disturbance. So, for example, an inference is a statement about the unknown based on what is known. So, for example, I may know that a person is looking at me, but I may have to infer whether they like me or do not like me. Now, in any given situation, we may have multiple inferences. It's important that you, when using the ABC model, learn to identify the most important hunch, the critical inference, the critical A, which lies at A and is important in helping you and then identify the rigid and extreme attitudes at point B. One way to identify your critical inference is by asking the question, what's the most distressing aspect of the adversity that I'm facing? So it might be, for example, if I'm in a situation and I'm thinking about someone who may or may not like me, it may very well be, I may have two inferences. One, this person may not like me. And then the other inference may be, therefore, I may not get the job opportunity I hope to get. And thereby, the inference, I will not get the job opportunity, is the critical A. So, what we're going to argue is that unlike our cognitive behavior therapy colleagues who emphasize disputing hunches because they may very well be distorted, we prefer to temporarily assume that the hunch may in fact be true, and then use it as a stepping stone to identify the rigid and extreme attitudes that lie at the core of our emotional consequences. Now, REBT also argues that the rigid basic attitudes give rise to what are known as derivative extreme attitudes. And these derivative extreme attitudes also play a very important role in our emotional upset. Examples of inferences would be things like, she will reject my offer. That's an inference about something that's going to happen in the future. On the other hand, if a person thinks about a past relationship and says, he took advantage of my naivete, then there's an inference being made about the past. Alternatively, a person may say, have the inference, the pain in my chest means I'm having a heart attack. That's an inference that's occurring and more or less focused on something that's occurring in the present. So inferences can be directed at the past, the present, or the future. Excuse me. Now, to use the ABC model effectively, not only do you have to identify your inferences at A and separate them out from the situational adversity, a description of the situation, but then you need to identify emotions and place them at point C in the ABC model. Now, I don't have time to go through all 8 basic emotions, but I'm going to use anger, anxiety, and shame as examples of emotions that would be placed at point C in the ABC model. Anger, an unhealthy feeling, motivates aggressive behavior. So one's anger and one's aggressive behavior would be placed at position C and would be the consequences of rigid and extreme attitudes at point B about some inference at A. Likewise, anxiety, an unhealthy emotion, encourages avoidant behavior, retreating in a self-protective way in the face of a threatening situation at A. So anxiety would be placed at point C, and the critical inference of the threat would be placed at point A. So with the example of anxiety, if one were to say, I'm going to be rejected tomorrow, or I'm going to be laid off tomorrow from work, that would be an inference at A, and one might have anxiety, and that would be placed at point C. Likewise, shame is an emotion that motivates people to withdraw from public view when they've fallen short of certain standards. Shame would be placed at point C, and the situational A would be performing in public. And then the critical inference at A might be something like, everybody will think I looked stupid. And therefore, that's an inference of what other people will thinking, or everybody will think I'm looking foolish. And then one might feel shame at C because of the inference at A. Now, REBT, again, emphasizes rigid and extreme attitudes, and the characteristics of rigid attitudes, also known as demandingness, are that they're dogmatic, they're not scientific, they're anti-empirical. Another characteristic of a rigid attitude is that it undermines creative and persistent effort. It produces dysfunctional negative emotions, and although these dysfunctional negative emotions may feel good to express in behavioral ways in the short run, they tend to produce long-term negative consequences. Rigid attitudes undermine our healthy interpersonal functioning. They are not consistent with observable data and are often very idealistic. And we would not teach these types of rigid attitudes to a child because they would lead to self-defeating behavior. And in essence, they may be considered to be immature. Rigid attitudes at point B generally have three foci: the self, other people, and life conditions. So, for example, rigid attitudes directed at the self would be attitudes such as, I have to perform perfectly well, or I have to act prudently, or I need to display poise at all times. So notice that the content is slightly different, but the rigid attitude is directed towards the self. Again, what we're trying to emphasize is the three foci of our rigid absolutistic attitudes: the self, others, and life conditions. Now, rigid attitudes at point B that would be directed at other people would be attitudes such as, you must treat me nicely. You have to treat me fairly. You absolutely have to support me. So again, the direction, the target of these attitudes are towards another person. And again, these would be placed at point B in the ABC model. They're attitudes. They're not inferences. Likewise, attitudes at point B that would be directed towards the conditions of life might be, life must be easy. Life should be comfortable. Life has to be predictable. So in this instance, we are upsetting ourselves about our demand of the conditions of life is what's at the core of our disturbance. These attitudes represent examples of rigid attitudes that would be directed at life. Notice that they're different than the attitudes I talked about that were directed at the self or attitudes that were directed at other people. As for extreme attitudes that derive from rigid attitudes, here are some examples. One is known as an extreme evaluative attitude of badness. It's sometimes referred to as awfulizing. It's awful, terrible, or the end of the world. So I might say, for example, I have to produce an ideal video on this topic, and it's awful, terrible, the end of the world if I fall short of my goal. Another rigid attitude is, it's unbearable, intolerable, I can't stand it. So for example, I might say that you have to treat me nicely. That would be the rigid attitude at point B. And then I might also add, it's unbearable, or I can't stand it when you're not warm and nice to me. And then the final rigid attitude is known as a devaluation. And that devaluation can be directed at the self, others, or life. So we might say something like, I have to do perfectly well, and if I don't, I'm lesser of a person. Here, the global devaluation is of the self. I might say, you have to treat me nicely, and if not, you are a bad person. There, the devaluation is placed at the other person. And I might say, life has to be easy, and if life isn't easy, or if it involves tragedy, it's totally bad. In each of these instances of devaluation, the individual is taking a negative part and confusing it with the whole. So other examples would be I'm a failure, I'm inadequate, I'm unlovable. One might fail, that's a negative part of life experience, but it doesn't make them a failure as a person. You may treat me badly, but that doesn't make you thoroughly rotten. Again, you may display an instance of misbehavior towards me, but that doesn't make you a bad person. And then finally, life may have very unfortunate events, but the whole of it isn't totally bad. That would be an example of devaluation. A person might say life's totally bad, or life sucks, or life absolutely must be comfortable, and if not, it's just not worth living. REBT aims to teach you to detect and modify self-defeating emotional and behavioral responses. But one needs to appreciate that thinking, feeling, and behavior, although interconnected, need to be identified separately during an emotional episode. And then we need to separate out beyond just separating our thinking, feelings, and behaviors. We also have to then discern the difference between our inferences at point A and our attitudes at point B. We also have to make a distinction between feelings and thoughts, because people will often say things like, I feel that I did poorly. Well, English permits that, but the bottom line here is that I feel I did poorly really is a cognition about performance. And that would be an inference, an evaluation of how we see ourselves as having performed. And I feel I did poorly would actually be an inference that should be placed at point A, because we might then be shameful at point C. And at point B, we would say, I have to do perfectly well. So again, just because we use the word feel, it doesn't mean we're really expressing an emotion. We may be expressing a thought. And in order to effectively use the ABC framework, one needs to understand that difference between thoughts and feelings, regardless of the words used. We need to learn to distinguish these different components, and sometimes that can be not so easy. And therefore, it takes some practice. And you could learn to do this by watching me on Saturdays when I work with a volunteer. You'll see me separate out the different components before I go into the disputing process. But you can also train yourself on your own by taking a piece of paper and writing the letters A, B, and C, and really trying to understand what your inferences or hunches are and placing them at A, placing your feelings at C, those emotions that are unhealthy and those behaviors that go along with those emotions, and then looking for one of the three rigid attitudes at point B, along with one of the three derivative attitudes that may be present at point B. I would like to thank you for viewing this video, and I would encourage you to go to my website, REBT Doctor, to learn more about REBT and view some of the other audios and videos found there.